Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really crucial. We're diving into the world of cybersecurity defense, what people call blue teaming.
Right.
We've pulled together insights from, well, a whole stack of top security operations sources.
Yeah.
Our mission today is really to cut through the complexity.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
Exactly. And find those really vital nuggets of knowledge for anyone who wants to properly understand how you actually build a solid cyber defense. And look, our journey today isn't just listing tools. That's not the point. It's about really getting why they matter, how they actually fit together, and where the most important spots for visibility and defense really are.
It's like building a fortress layer by layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Understanding each part. We're going all the way from like the basic network layout right up to those super fast incident containment moves.
And what's so interesting, I think, is how all these pieces are connected. That network foundation, the tiny details and logs, the analytics, it's all one system, really. Yeah. We want to make sure you get those aha moments today. Feel like you really get it, not just, drowned in info.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Right.
You're listening because you want a solid understanding, but like something you can actually digest. So let's start right at the beginning. The network.
Yep.
Why is understanding that architecture, the shape of the network, the absolute first step for any defender? What does that shape even mean?
It's completely fundamental because how your network is laid out, that basically defines your whole defense strategy.
Right.
Think about defending, a huge open field versus defending a castle, right, with walls and moats.
Okay, yeah.
Modern networks, they're usually broken up into these isolated bits or zones. And there are strict rules, access control lists, ACLs, saying what traffic can go where. You might have microsegmentation in your data center or maybe separate virtual private clouds, VPCs, up in the cloud. Mm-hmm. Understanding this structure, who talks to who and where. That's step one. It tells you where to put your defenses, where to look for problems.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. A simple choice in network design. It can be the difference between a small problem and, well, a massive breach that makes the headlines.
Absolutely.
Remember WannaCry and NotPetya back in 2017? Those things were nasty.
Yeah.
They combined like top-tier exploits with the ability to just spread automatically across flat, open networks.
Devastating.
Totally. But for companies that had segmented their networks, that design choice, it bought their blue team vital time.
Critical time.
Time to spot the spread, contain it, stop a little infection, turning into, an absolute disaster. It's all about creating those choke points, making it harder for the attacker.
Exactly. And to spot those movements, to stop them, you obviously need to see the traffic. Visibility is key.
So how do we actually see this traffic? This stuff flowing across the network that's normally invisible. What are the main ways we get that visibility?
Well, your main routers and firewalls, they're important. They give you flow information, they control access, but you usually need more dedicated tools, like a span port or a mirror port on a switch can copy traffic over to a monitoring port. That's okay for lower traffic volumes.
Good.
But, and this is important, they can drop packets if they get overloaded. Like sending 2 gigs of traffic to a 1 gig monitoring port. You'll lose stuff.
Right, not ideal.
Not at all. So for serious high volume traffic, especially if it's full duplex, network taps are generally preferred. These are actual hardware devices. They sit in line and physically make a perfect copy of the traffic in both directions. No packet loss.
Gotcha. It's hardware taps for the heavy lifting. What else?
Moving up a bit, you've got flow logs. You often hear it called net flow. These are usually captured by agents on your routers, firewalls, maybe switches. They give you the basics. Source IP, destination IP, ports, protocol, how much data. Really good for high-level anomaly hunting.
Like spotting big data transfers.
Exactly. Or lateral movement, malware calling home on weird ports. And the great thing, the data size is tiny, like 1/1100th the size of capturing all the packets.
Wow, okay. Efficient.
Very. But sometimes you need more detail. That's where layer 7 metadata tools like Zeek come in. Zeek is amazing. Think of it like a prism for your network traffic.
Prism.
Yeah, It takes the raw packets, the PCAP, and splits out all this structured data based on the protocol. Gives you HTTP methods, DNS query types, host names, SMTP details, much richer context than just flow logs. Still relatively small data size, too.
That sounds powerful.
It really is. And then you have the elephant. full PCAP,
Right.
full packet capture.
A whole lot.
Every single byte that goes across the wire, usually captured using tools based on WinPCAP or libPCAP libraries. When you have a really critical incident, this is your ground truth, your undeniable evidence. Tools like Wireshark, that's the standard for digging into PCA. You can replay entire conversations, pull out files, everything.
Okay, so the key takeaway here seems to be, when an alert goes off, you need to know instantly, okay, which sensor, which type of data do I need to investigate this? Span, TAP, Flow, Zeek, PCAP. Understanding these lets you react effectively.
Precisely.
Right, now that we've got the network foundations down, let's dive into some specific protocols, the ones blue teams really need to get. Let's kick off with DNS, the Internet's phone book, right?
Yeah.
How does that actually work, and why is it so critical for spotting threats?
Yeah, DNS, domain name system, it's this huge hierarchical system. Its job is basically translating names we use, like, example.com, into the IP addresses computers need. It's a multi-step process. Your computer asks a recursive DNS server, which might then have to ask a root server, then a top-level domain or TLD server, like for .com or .org, and finally the authoritative server for that specific domain to get the actual IP.
And caching helps speed that up.
Oh, massively. It's cached all over the place. But for defenders, the key things to watch are specific record types. A and AAA records, they're the most common. Map a host name to an IPv4 or IPv6 address. And remember, one name can point to many IPs, or many names can point to one IP. That's important.
Yep.
Then you have PTR records. That's the reverse lookup, IP back to a name. But honestly, they're kind of mediocre for security, often unreliable.
How so?
Well, the mapping might not be consistent. Like a Google IP might correctly point back to google.com, but because of how they manage things, it might also resolve to some totally unrelated, maybe even malicious domain like c703.info that just happens to be hosted there temporarily. So you can't always trust PTR.
Good to know. What else?
MX records point to mail servers. NS records say which DNS servers are in charge, the authoritative ones for a domain. But the main point for security is simple. When you browse the web, you connect to an IP address, not the name itself. DNS provides that translation. So DNS traffic, it's often one of the very first signs that something fishy is going on.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
But the future, DNS over HTTPS, DOH. Sounds like it messes things up for defenders, right? Encrypting the phone book lookups?
It definitely presents a big challenge. Yeah. DOH is great for user privacy, wraps those DNS lookups inside standard web encryption, TLS.
So it just looks like regular web traffic.
Pretty much. Makes it much harder for security tools to just peek inside and see what domains are being looked up.
So how do security teams keep that visibility if they can't easily see the DNS queries anymore?
It forces changes in how you monitor. You might need to block DH traffic going to any servers you don't control, or ensure all DOH traffic, even encrypted, gets logged somehow. Or in enterprise settings, maybe enforce specific DNS configurations where you can decrypt and inspect that traffic. It's tricky.
Okay, so given how vital DNS is, and this evolving landscape with DOH, attackers must abuse it constantly. What are the common tricks we need to watch out for?
Oh, they get creative. Some top-level domains, TLDs, just have a bad reputation statistically. Things like .tk, .poker, .xxx. You see more bad stuff there. Domain age is a simple but effective one. Brand new domains. Much more likely to be malicious than established ones. Checking whose creation dates helps. Malware often uses domain generation algorithms, DGAs. These create these random-looking, constantly changing domain names, super hard to block with simple lists, and a big flashing sign that it's probably malware calling home.
That sounds nasty.
It is. We also look for unauthorized DNS server use, like malware on a machine bypassing your internal DNS servers and talking directly to some external one, maybe one controlled by the attacker.
So you need logs from everywhere, not just your main DNS server.
Exactly. You need to see all DNS requests happening on your network, and maybe even TLS decryption if they're using DOH. Then there's DNS record modification. This is more advanced. Attackers compromise your DNS admin accounts, change records, maybe get valid TLS certificates for your domain, clone your website for phishing. Big problems.
So MFA and change monitoring are key there.
Absolutely crucial. And then there's DNS tunneling, sneaky one. They encode data inside DNS queries, often using weird record types like NULL or packing data into subdomains. Lots of queries to unknown domains like this. Very suspicious. Exfiltrating data bit by bit.
Wow.
Anything else?
Yeah, a couple more. We're seeing attackers use blockchain DNS, BDNS sometimes, these decentralized systems, like for .bazaar or .coin domains, harder to take down because there's no central registrar.
More resilient C2.
Right. And finally, watch out for internationalized domain names, IDNs, or homoglyphs, using characters from other alphabets that look like English letters to make look-alike domains.
Like the classic O replaced with a 0, but more subtle.
Exactly. Like Microzerosoft 365.xyz using a 0, or using Cyrillic letters that look identical. But the key is, in your logs, these appear in their punycode format, starting with XDNN. That prefix is your giveaway. Easy way to spot them.
Okay, that's a really thorough look at DNS. Super important stuff. Let's shift gears now to HTTP, the language of the web.
At its core, a web server is just doing fancy file sharing over HTTP, right? Can you break down the basics of a URL and the key HTTP bits for analysis?
Sure. A URL has the protocol, like HTTP or HTTPS, the host name, the website name, the path, the specific page or file, and sometimes parameters after a question mark. When your browser asks for something, it uses an HTTP method. GET is common for grabbing data, and the request details are often right there in the URL, visible in logs. POST is used for sending data, maybe larger files or sensitive stuff like passwords, and that data is in the body of the request, not usually logged in the URL itself.
Okay. And for defenders digging through logs, what are the crucial headers to pay attention to?
Several are key. The host header is vital. It tells you the actual domain the user was trying to reach, which is essential when multiple websites share the same IP address. The user agent header identifies the browser or client software. Malware often uses fake or really old, outdated user agents, so looking for unusual ones or doing frequency analysis to spot outliers can be useful. The referer header, and yes, it's famously misspelled in the standard, shows the URL the user came from. Sometimes you find interesting, maybe malicious, links embedded there. And the cookie header, usually for session tracking, but attackers abuse it. Some malware, like Chech's or even NotPetya, encoded command and control data right into the cookie header, often base 64 encoded. Sneaky.
Wow, hiding C2 in a cookie.
Yep. And finally, HTTP response codes are critical. 200 OK means success. 301 or 302 are redirects. Error codes like 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden tell you something went wrong. Essential context.
What's really striking here is how HTTP, just plain old web traffic, ends up being a major tool for attackers at pretty much every stage. Delivery, exploit, C2, getting the data out.
It's ubiquitous, so they leverage it heavily. For detection, basic reputation checks on URLs and domains are step one, using things like VirusTotal or allscan.io.
But a good domain can still host bad stuff, right? Like a hacked blog.
Exactly. Context matters. We also hunt for those suspicious user agents we mentioned and suspicious encoded content. Seeing base64 encoded data in weird places like cookie headers or POST bodies, often a sign of APT malware. Attackers love using HTTP or HTTPS for malicious file serving. Dropping malware executables, often hosted on compromised legit sites or even file sharing services like Dropbox. We saw Lazarus Group do that.
Right.
Repeated GET or post activity is another big one. Seeing a machine make frequent regular HTTP requests out to the same place. Classic C2 check-in behavior. And a huge red flag. GET or POST directly to an IP address instead of a host name. Almost all normal web traffic uses names. Going straight to an IP, highly suspicious, likely C2.
Makes sense.
Attackers also heavily use free dynamic DNS services, done DNS, no IP, those sorts of things. Easy to set up, easy to change the IP address behind the name, so any traffic going to the parent domains of these services, definitely worth a closer look.
And then you have the really sophisticated stuff.
Yeah, like Cobalt Strike Beacon. It's designed to blend in. It can make its C2 traffic look like, say, a normal request for a jQuery file. It might use the cookie header for passing commands back and forth. Incredibly hard to spot without really deep analysis and understanding the context.
So this is all evolving. What about the future? HTTP2 and HTTP3, you mentioned they change things. How does that impact analysis?
They absolutely do. HTTP2 uses just one underlying TCP connection, but multiplexes different requests into streams and frames. The big change for defenders. Headers are now binary, not plain text. You need tools like Wireshark that understand the HPT compression to interpret them, makes quick analysis harder.
And HTTP3?
Even more challenging. HTTP3 runs on top of QUIC, which is based on UDP, not TCP, and QUIC encrypts everything with TLS pretty much from the start. Even the initial handshake details are harder to see. Wireshark only recently got good support for decoding HTTP3's QPay header compression.
So less visibility again.
Fundamentally, yes. QUIC is a really big deal for network defenders. More and more protocols are likely going to start using it, wrapping themselves in that default encryption. The blind spots are growing.
Which brings us perfectly to the broader challenge. TLS encryption itself. Everything's using it now. Great for users, obviously, but a massive headache for defenders trying to see what's going on. Attackers hide inside it.
That's the nub of it. Many places just can't, or choose not to, decrypt all their TLS traffic. Performance reasons, privacy concerns, and the latest standard, TLS 1.3, makes decryption even harder technically. Plus, like we said, protocols like DOH are now hiding inside TLS too.
So, okay, if we can't always decrypt, what can we still do? Can we spot bad TLS traffic without seeing the actual contents?
Yes, definitely. There are non-decryption techniques. You can still see the destination IP address and port.
Okay.
Basic but useful. Check against deny lists, look up the ASN, the geolocation, and crucially, seeing SSL TLS on an unusual port, not the standard 443, that's always suspicious.
Okay, IP import. What else?
Fingerprinting. JA3, JA3S, and JARM fingerprinting. This is clever.
How does that work?
Every piece of software, every browser, every bit of malware sets up its TLS connection slightly differently. The specific TLS version, the cipher suites it offers, the extensions it supports. JA3 takes a bunch of those details from the client's initial client hello message and creates a unique MD5 hash from them. It's like a fingerprint for the client software initiating the connection.
So you can tell Firefox from Chrome or malware.
Exactly. You can often distinguish specific browsers, legitimate applications, Tor clients, or even known malware families like Emotet just from this JA3 hash, without decrypting anything. JA3S is the equivalent fingerprint for the server's response, and JARM is another specialized server fingerprinting technique, really powerful for spotting anomalies.
Wow, that's cool. Anything else visible?
Yes. One more critical piece, at least for now. In TLS 1.2 and earlier versions, the server name indication, SNI field, is sent in plain text during the handshake. This tells you the actual host name, the domain the client is trying to connect to, even within the encrypted session. Super useful.
Hugely useful. But there's a catch. A new feature in TLS 1.3 called Encrypted Client WIM. Hello, ECH, is starting to roll out. Its whole purpose is to encrypt that SNI field too.
Ah, so that visibility is going away.
It looks like it, yeah, which makes non-decryption analysis even harder and techniques like JA3JRM even more important.
Okay, so it's clear. Analyzing encrypted traffic is a moving target. You need to be methodical, look at the metadata. You can see IPs, ports, fingerprints, SNI while it lasts, and piece together the puzzle.
Couldn't have said it better.
Right. We've covered the network, the core protocols. Let's pivot now. Let's talk about defending the actual endpoints, the computers, the servers, especially after an attacker gets past that initial perimeter. So an attacker's in. What happens next? They usually follow a kind of playbook, right? The MITRE, ATT, and CK matrix maps this out brilliantly. What are the typical post-exploitation tactics attackers use once they're inside? Yeah, once they land, they have goals. First up is often persistence. They want to make sure they can stay in, even if the machine reboots or the user logs off. They might add registry keys, create scheduled tasks, things like that. Then comes discovery. They need to figure out where they are. What's this environment like? What accounts exist? What permissions do they have? What files are interesting? Are there other machines nearby? They often use built-in operating system commands for this net user ipconfig task list, which makes it blend in, hard to spot.
Living off the land.
Exactly. Next, they'll likely try privilege escalation. They want more power. Get from a regular user account up to an administrator or system-level access. They might exploit bugs in software, try to steal passwords, or abuse weak permissions on files or services. You know, maybe they can modify a file that an admin runs at startup, or hijack a service executable if the path isn't quoted properly, or use DLL hijacking.
There's that newer technique, too. BYOBD.
Right, bring your own vulnerable driver. Nasty stuff. Attackers use legitimate digitally signed drivers that happen to have vulnerabilities, maybe an old version of the Process Explorer driver, for example. They load this trusted driver and then exploit its flaws to gain kernel-level access, often specifically to disable or kill security tools. We've seen that with malware like Awkill and Backstab.
Ouch. Okay, what else?
Credential access. Especially on Windows, stealing passwords is huge. Tools like Mimikatz are infamous for pulling credentials straight out of memory, from the LSASS process or from registry keys. Getting just one admin password can often let an attacker spread rapidly across the whole network.
Which leads to
lateral movement, pivoting. Moving from the first machine they compromised to other machines in the network, searching for valuable data or higher privileges. They use standard remote admin tools for this SSH, SMB, often with tools like PISA-6, PowerShell remoting, WMI for command line access, or RDP VNC for graphical access. And finally, the goal, exfiltration, stealing the data they came for. This usually involves finding the data, gathering it together, maybe compressing or encrypting it, staging it, and then sending it out. They might use obvious channels like FTP or SSH if they can, or try to hide it in normal-looking traffic like DNS queries or HTTPS POST requests.
So it's a methodical process. Recon inside, gain power, spread out, grab the goods. And the key thing here, I think, is that a lot of these stages, these tactics, they're happening on the host. You need endpoint visibility to cache them.
Absolutely. Network defenses are crucial, but they won't see everything happening inside a compromised machine.
Okay, so if that's how attackers operate inside, how do we build our defenses on the endpoint? Well, we need that layered approach, right? Defense in depth. What does that look like on a typical workstation or server?
It starts with the basics, the foundations. Inventory and patching. You cannot defend what you don't know you have. So know what software is running everywhere. Use network scanning like Nmap or proper inventory systems. And then patch vulnerabilities. Prioritize based not just on how severe the bug is, but also on whether it's actually being exploited in the wild. Then you have anti-exploitation technologies, things like Windows Defender Exploit Guard, which includes features like exploit protection, controlled folder access, network protection, attack surface reduction rules. These aim to block the techniques attackers use to exploit vulnerabilities, even if the specific vulnerability isn't patched yet.
Hardening the system itself.
Exactly. And speaking of hardening, credential guard and virtualization-based security, VBS, in Windows are huge. They isolate that critical LSAS process, the one that handles passwords and tickets, inside a secure, virtualized container. Makes it incredibly difficult for tools like Mimikatz to just dump credentials from memory.
Yeah.
Big step up.
Nice. What about firewalls on the host?
Host firewalls are absolutely critical. Don't underestimate them. They can stop lateral movement dead in its tracks. If a compromised machine tries to connect outbound on a weird port for C2 or tries to reach another internal machine via SSB, the host firewall can block it and log it. It's like a personal bodyguard for each endpoint.
Okay. And good old AV, still relevant.
Antivirus, AV. Definitely still relevant. It's your first line against known malicious files getting installed or executed. Modern AV uses machine learning and behavioral analysis, not just old signatures. Now, can it be bypassed? Sure. Skilled attackers work hard to do that. But AV catches a lot of the common stuff, significantly reduces the noise your analysts have to deal with.
Right. Filters out the easy stuff.
Precisely. Then there's application control, or allow listing. Tools like App Locker or Windows Defender Application Control, WDAC, these are really powerful. Instead of blocking known bad, they only allow known good programs to run. Anything else, blocked by default.
That sounds really effective. What's the catch?
The catch is managing it, keeping the allow list up to date, and attackers can try to bypass it using those living off the land techniques, abusing legitimate signed OS tools like PowerShell or Rundle32 for malicious ends, or using code injection into already running allowed processes. So it's not foolproof, but it raises the bar significantly.
Okay. What else is in the endpoint defense toolkit?
File integrity monitoring, FIM, is important. Tools that watch critical system files and registry keys for unauthorized changes, often part of a host intrusion detection or prevention system. HID ships. Great for catching persistence attempts. Privileged access workstations, Purlabue, are a great concept for admins. Dedicated lockdown machines used only for high-privileged tasks. Nothing else. No email, no web browsing. Massively reduces the risk of admin credentials getting compromised and used for lateral movement.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Keep the keys to the kingdom safe.
Exactly. And then the big one these days, endpoint detection and response, EDR. Think of EDR as the flight data recorder for your endpoints. It logs incredibly detailed activity, processes starting, files being written, network connections, registry changes, command lines, everything.
It's a massive visibility.
Huge visibility into exactly what's happening on the host, perfect for spotting those stealthy post-exploitation tactics. And they are, and EDR is response. These tools usually let analysts remotely isolate a machine, kill processes, delete files, pull samples for analysis, game changer for incident response.
Wow, okay, two more. DLP and UWEBA.
Right, data loss prevention, DLP. These tools, both on the network and the host, look for sensitive data patterns like credit card numbers, social security numbers, trying to leave the network, or being accessed inappropriately. Helps catch data theft during discovery, collection, exfiltration phases, and user and entity behavior analytics, UVEBA. These systems baseline normal activity for users and devices, and then look for deviations, for anomalies. Someone logging in at a weird time, accessing files they never touch, unusual data transfers. UEBA uses statistics and machine learning to find outliers. Can be great for spotting insider threats or compromised accounts, but needs careful tuning to avoid false positives.
Okay, so putting all those layers together, patching, hardening, firewalls, AV, app control, FIM, PAWS, EDR, DLP, UEBA, that creates a much tougher environment for an attacker. Way more obstacles, way more chances to get caught.
That's the whole idea of defense in depth. Make their job as difficult and noisy as possible.
And crucially, nearly all of these defenses, especially EDR, they generate data. They generate logs. Which brings us to our next major topic. Logs. You could argue they're the single most important data source for any security team. But how do they actually work? How does Windows log things versus Linux? What do defenders need to know about just getting the logs?
Yeah, logs are the lifeblood. In Windows, logs get written to these .evtx files. It's a binary XML format, not just plain text. They're organized into different channels. You got the security log, system, application, and many others. The really critical insight for modern defense, especially against fileless malware, is enabling PowerShell logging. Specifically, Event ID 4104 script block logging. This logs the actual PowerShell code being executed, even if it's just run in memory. Hugely important, but often off by default. Also need logs from AppLocker, Windows Defender, Sysmin if you're using it.
Okay, binary XML for Windows. Got to turn on PowerShell logging. What about Linux?
Linux traditionally uses syslog. It's mostly text-based, can be kind of a pain to parse sometimes, often needs complex regex. By default, it often gets sent over UDP port 514, which is unencrypted. It uses concepts called facility, like kernel, auth, mail, and severity, like info, warning, critical, to categorize messages. More modern Linux systems also use the systemed journal. This is a binary structured format. Much easier to query and parse reliably using the journal ectl command. But you need tools that understand that format. So yeah, different systems, different formats, different collection methods. Understanding that is key to actually getting the data into your SIEM.
Right, so it's fascinating how the basic plumbing of logging differs. And that directly impacts how easy or hard it is to analyze later.
Yeah.
Now we know where do they come from, how do we actually read the signs, what specific log events should blue teams be actively looking for?
Certain events are just pure gold for defenders. In Windows, logins are fundamental. Event ID 4625 for success, 4625 for failure, tells you who logged in, with what account type, from where. Also 4648, which shows someone used the runas command to run something as a different user. Super important context.
Okay, logins, what else?
Process creation logs. These are arguably among the most important. On Windows, you typically get this from Sysmin, Event ID 1, or EDR. On Linux, from tools like Audit, Snoopy, or Sysdig. These logs capture the executable path, the command line arguments used, the parent process that launched it, the user context. This is how you spot those living off the land attacks where PowerShell.exe or WMI.exe are being used for evil. Absolutely critical.
Got it. Process creation, vital.
Yep. Firewall logs, too. From the Windows Firewall or Linux IPTable NF tables, they show you what connections were allowed or blocked, source to destination IPs, and ports, protocol. Essential for tracking network activity at the host level. If you enable it, Windows Object Access Auditing can be powerful. Event 4656, handle requested, and 4663, access attempt log when someone tries to read, write, or delete specific sensitive files or registry keys you've configured for auditing.
More granular visibility.
Exactly. Also, service installation 4697 and scheduled task creation 4698. Classic persistence and lateral movement techniques for malware. Seeing a new service or task pop up unexpectedly, big red flag. User and group changes. Windows Event 4720 for user creation, 4732 adding a user to a privileged group, 4728 adding a member to a global security group, someone creating a new admin account, or adding a user to domain admins. Huge indicator of compromise.
Makes sense.
We mentioned PowerShell logs, 4104 script block logging, absolutely vital for seeing the actual commands run, catching advanced attacks. And in Active Directory environments, Kerberos log events like 476 EGT request and 476-94770 service ticket request renewal help track authentication flows. On Linux, you'd look in varlog secure or equivalent for SSH login failures, brute force attempts.
Okay, so lots of specific events to hunt for. But raw logs, even the important ones, are still just raw data. How do we turn that mountain of data into something actually useful, into real intelligence? What's the pipeline look like?
Right, the log pipeline is crucial. It starts with collection. Getting the logs from the endpoints or network devices to your central system, usually a SIEM. This happens either via agent software installed in the endpoint that pushes logs, or sometimes agentless, where the central system pulls logs, maybe from a network share or via WMI. Agents are generally more reliable. Once you have the logs, you need to parse them. This means breaking down that raw log message, whether it's text or XML or JSON, into distinct fields, like extracting the source heap, username, evented, message, etc.
That sounds tricky for the unstructured text logs.
It can be. Requires regular expressions, which can be brittle and complex. Structured formats like key value pairs or especially JSON are much easier and more reliable to parse, although JSON can be a bit less efficient storage-wise.
Okay, parsed into fields. Then what?
Normalization. This is about standardizing the field names. Different vendors, different devices, they all call the source IP address something different. Source address, client IP. Normalization maps all of these to one consistent name, maybe sourcep. This makes searching and correlation across all your different data sources possible. Hugely important for usability.
Makes sense. Standard names for everything.
Exactly. And then comes what I think is one of the most powerful steps: enrichment.
Adding context.
Precisely. This is where your SIEM takes the basic fields from the log and adds more information by looking things up in other data sources. You might take a domain name from a DNS log and look up its registration age, its popularity rank, its category like webmail or dynamic DNS, maybe a risk score. You might take an IP address and look up its reputation, who owns it, the ASN, where it's located geographically, whether it's a known Tor exit node, how many times it's shown up on VirusTotal.
So you turn a simple log into something much richer.
Exactly. You turn these low-feature logs, maybe just an IP and a port, into high-feature logs packed with context. This is the magic. This is how you dramatically reduce false positives and spot the really malicious activity. A simple DNS lookup alert becomes high-risk alert. Newly registered, low-popularity domain in suspicious category looked up from critical server. That's the power of enrichment.
Okay, that pipeline collect, parse, normalize, enrich, that makes a world of difference. Now, with all this enriched data flooding into the Security Operations Center, the SOC, mastering the SOC is about handling that flow. Efficient triage, smart analytics, automation, and finally, containment. Let's start with triage.
Yeah.
It sounds like one of the toughest, most critical jobs an analyst does, like being an ear doctor, right?
Yeah.
Limited time, multiple emergencies. How do you even define a dangerous alert? What makes something jump to the front of the queue?
That's a great analogy. A dangerous alert isn't just about a high severity score. It's about the context and potential impact. Is this attack close to achieving its final goal? Is it targeting something really valuable, critical servers, domain controllers, key executives, sensitive databases? Is the attacker sophisticated, maybe targeted? Is this something totally new, something we've never seen before? Basically anything that could cause major damage, cost a lot to fix, or be really hard to recover from if it succeeds. That's dangerous.
So when that alert pops up, how do analysts quickly figure out where to focus? You mentioned the cyber kill chain earlier. Does that help prioritize?
Absolutely. The cyber kill chain recon, weaponization, delivery, exploit, installation, command and control, actions on objectives is a great mental model for this. An alert indicating activity later in the chain, like C2 traffic or signs of data exfiltration, actions on objectives, is almost always higher priority than something early on, like reconnaissance scans.
Closer to the goal equals higher priority.
Generally, yes. You also have to factor in the criticality of the asset involved. An alert on your main database server is more urgent than the same alert on a random workstation. And the potential impact on users or the business, it's a combination of factors.
Now, the source have brought up something really interesting here, the psychology of intelligence analysis. How our own minds, our biases can get in the way, especially confirmation bias. How do defenders fight that tendency to just look for evidence that confirms what they already suspect?
That's a huge challenge. Confirmation bias is powerful. We naturally seek out info that supports our initial theory. To counter this, there's a structured technique called analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH.
Okay, ACH. How does it work?
Instead of trying to prove your main hypothesis, ACH forces you to try and disprove it, along with several other plausible, mutually exclusive hypotheses. You systematically list all the evidence you have for and against each hypothesis. Then you analyze the diagnosticity of each piece of evidence. How strongly does it point towards one hypothesis while ruling out others? Finally, you try to refute each hypothesis based on the evidence. The one that's hardest to disprove is often your most likely answer.
So it forces you to consider alternatives fairly.
Exactly. It's rigorous, it reduces bias, and it leaves a clear audit trail of your thinking process. Really valuable for complex investigations.
All this pressure, the constant alerts, the complex analysis, it sounds like burnout could be a real issue in the SOC. What's the difference between good stress, the kind that motivates, and that bad, grinding stress?
Yeah, burnout is a serious concern. Good stress, eustress, feels like a challenge you can meet. Learning something new, solving a tough problem, being creative, it's engaging. Bad stress, distress, feels persistent, overwhelming, like you lack control. Maybe dealing with broken tools, information overload, lack of cooperation, feeling like you can't actually do anything effective.
Right.
We want to maximize the good stress and minimize the bad. The sources talk about the human capital model for this. It's about creating this positive feedback loop. It involves developing skills through good training, maybe online courses, CTFs, mentoring. This leads to growth, expanding your abilities, which fuels creativity, finding new ways to solve problems, automating boring stuff. And all of this relies on empowerment.
Empowerment meaning?
Meaning analysts actually have the tools, the access to logs, the authority to take action run queries, blot an IP, isolate a host, maybe even write their own detection rules. Feeling powerless is a massive source of frustration and burnout.
So that raises a key question then. How do we empower analysts? How do we free them up from the repetitive grind so they can focus on the interesting, creative, empowering work?
Giving them the ability to design their own analytics, their own detection rules, is a huge part of that empowerment. When you're designing these rules, there's always that tension between sensitivity catching every possible bad thing and specificity avoiding false positives, not alerting on benign stuff.
They work against each other, right? More sensitive usually means less specific.
Typically, yes, it's a balancing act. But that data enrichment we talked about earlier, that's your best friend here. Adding all that extra context helps you make rules more specific without sacrificing too much sensitivity. You can differentiate the real threats better.
Okay, so enrichment helps tune the rules. What kinds of analytic rules can analysts actually build? What are the common approaches?
There are several main types. Lists are fundamental. You have deny lists, known bad IPs, domains, file hashes, often from threat intelligence feeds, block anything on the list. And you have allow lists, known good applications, processes, domains. These are powerful because they work on the principle of, if it's not on this list of good things, it must be suspicious. Great for finding unknown bad stuff, like in application control.
Okay, lists. What else?
Thresholds. Alerting when something happens too much, a spike, too little, a flat line, or a certain number of times in a window, frequency. Think brute force login attempts, X failures in Y minutes. SQL injection attempts, many database errors. DNS tunneling, high volume of weird DNS queries. Or recon scans, lots of connection attempts. Then there are new term rules or first seen rules. These are really neat. They alert the first time a specific value appears in a field, like the first time your network talks to a particular domain or the first time a specific process runs on a server.
A fantastic middle ground, kind of, between deny and allow listing. Catches novelty.
Exactly. Great for spotting new C2 domains or malware just starting up. And finally, sequence-based rules. These look for a specific series of events happening in a defined order. Harder to build, but can detect complex attack patterns. But a good piece of advice often given is detect the links, not the chain. Keep your rules focused on detecting individual, high-confidence, malicious activities rather than trying to build one giant, complex rule for an entire multi-stage attack. Simpler rules are often more robust.
Right. Focus on the key steps. And this is where it gets really interesting for collaboration, for moving past being locked into one vendor's tools. Sigma rules. Tell us about those.
Sigma is a fantastic initiative. Think of it like this. Sigma is to log analysis what snort rules are to network traffic analysis or what YAR rules are to file analysis.
A common language.
Precisely. It's a generic, high-level language written in simple YAML format for describing detection logic based on log events. You write one Sigma rule describing a specific tactic, like detects Mimikatz execution via PowerShell. Then there are open source converters that can automatically translate that generic Sigma rule into the specific query language needed for dozens of different SUMs and log platforms, Splunk, Elasticsearch, Curadar, Azure Sentinel, you name it.
So you can share detection logic easily.
Exactly. Across teams, across organizations, even publicly. It breaks down vendor lock-in for detection rules. Sigma rules also have tags for categorization, like mapping to ATT and CK tactics, and can be shared automatically via threat intelligence platforms like MIS ISP. It's all about building that collective defense, sharing knowledge effectively.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, alongside better analytics, automation is key to freeing up analysts, right? Getting rid of the repetitive stuff.
Absolutely. That's where SOAR platforms come in security orchestration, automation, and response. These tools are all about automating workflows.
Using playbooks.
Yeah, they often call them playbooks or runbooks. These are predefined sequences of automated actions that the SR tool executes, either for investigating an alert or for taking response actions. Now, SR isn't magic. A lot of it is basically scripting with a nice graphical interface. It makes orchestrating actions across different security tools, your SIEM, EDR, firewall, threat intel platform, much easier to manage than writing custom scripts for everything.
What's the main goal?
The main goal is toil elimination, automating those manual, repetitive, low-value tasks that analysts hate doing. Things like looking up an IP address on VirusTotal for the 100th time that day. Freeing up human brains for the stuff that requires actual thinking and creativity. Remember, pretty much anything you can do in a SAR tool, you could theoretically script yourself in PowerShell or Python, but so makes it more accessible and manageable.
So what are some typical things people automate with SR?
Lots of common use cases. Data enrichment is huge, automatically querying VirusTotal, passive DNS, IP reputation services, geolocation databases to add context to alerts before an analyst even sees them. Blocking actions. The SOR platform can talk directly to your firewall API to block an IP, tell your EDR to isolate a host, add a hash to your AV block list, update a rule in your email gateway, or block a domain at your DNS server.
Taking automated response actions.
Right. Sample and info gathering is another big one. When a suspicious file alert comes in, the SOR playbook can automatically trigger the EDR tool to retrieve a copy of the file, grab forensic artifacts like the process list, task list, network connections, netstat, DNS cache, maybe even a memory image, all ready for the analyst, and alert and case management. Automatically creating tickets in your help desk system, populating fields with data from the alert, assigning it to the right team, notifying people, streamlines the whole workflow.
Okay, so automation handles the routine stuff. But what about when you have a confirmed incident, a real intrusion? You need to stop the bleeding, fast, containment. What are the options there?
Containment is critical, and you need to act decisively. The options range quite a bit. The most absolute, maybe old school, but effective method: physical isolation. Go unplug the network cable. Requires someone to be physically there, obviously, but it works.
Can't argue with that. What about network level containment?
And you've got options at different layers. Layer 2, switch level. This is pretty effective, but can be disruptive. You can log into the network switch and disable the port the infected machine is plugged into, or move that port into an isolated VLAN that can't talk to anything else, or maybe assign a bogus, non-routable IP address to the machine's MACI address via DHCP reservations. Layer 3, router firewall level. You can use access control lists, ACLs, on routers or firewalls to block all traffic to or from the compromised machine's IP address. Or maybe black hole the traffic, routing it to nowhere. Layer 4, firewall level. You could block specific TCP or UDP ports being used by the malware. The problem is malware often uses common ports like 80 or 443 to blend in, so this isn't always surgically effective without blocking legitimate stuff too.
Okay, so network containment. What about stopping it right on the infected host itself?
Host-based containment gives you more granular control sometimes. You can use the host firewall itself, like run PowerShell commands remotely to add firewall rules, blocking specific outbound ports, or preventing a specific malicious program from making any network connections. Application control, if you have it, can prevent the malicious executable from running again. A simple trick is modifying the machine's hosts file. You can add an entry that points the malicious C2 domain name to 110.7.0.0.1 localhost, so even if the malware tries to call home, it just talks to itself. And your EDR tool, or features like Windows Defender Exploit Guard's network protection, often have built-in functions to isolate the host or block specific network connections programmatically.
Lots of options on the host. What else? Can we block things higher up?
Yes. DNS-based blocks are very effective, especially using response policy zones, RPZ. You configure your internal DNS servers to basically lie. When asked for the IP of a known malicious domain, the DNS server can return a fake IP, like a sinkhole server you control. or just refuse to answer. You can also block entire dynamic DNS parent domains known to be abused by attackers.
Cutting off their communication path.
Exactly. And don't forget email-based blocks. Your mail gateway, SMTP server, usually has features to block emails based on sender address, domain, sending IP, specific header content, words in the body, or even certain types of attachments like encrypted zip files, which are often used to deliver malware past scanners. You can flag as spam or just quarantine them entirely.
Okay, so a whole arsenal of containment tools, from yanking the plug to fine-grained firewall rules and DNS tricks. The challenge, I guess, is picking the right one fast, while causing the least necessary disruption to the business.
That's the constant balancing act. Requires planning, practice, and knowing your tools and your network inside out.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the absolute fundamentals of network layout and protocols like DNS and HTTP, through the weeds of endpoint tactics and defenses, the critical role of logs and enrichment, all the way to mastering the SOC triage, analytics, automation, and finally containment. It really highlights the sheer breadth of what the Blue Team does. It's a non-stop learning process.
It really is. And if you zoom out, the bigger picture here is about building this continuously improving defense. It's not static. It's about empowering the analyst, fostering that curiosity and creativity, encouraging them to practice deliberately, like athletes, to stay sharp against adversaries who are constantly evolving too. The goal is to make the SOC a place where people want to work, where they feel effective, where they're not just drowning in repetitive tasks, but are actively engaged in hunting and defending.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, here's that final provocative thought for you to chew on. The source material clearly points out how attackers use DNS names for their command and control so they can easily switch IP addresses if a server gets shut down. We talked about the challenge of encrypted DNS like DWH, making it harder for defenders to see those lookups. But what if defenders could flip the script? What if, even without seeing the traffic, they could work together to proactively poison the public DNS caches for known malicious C2 domains, effectively making those domains resolved incorrectly for everyone, globally, thus disrupting attacker operations on a massive scale, pulling the rug out from under them even when their traffic is hidden? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Blue Team fundamentals. Keep learning, keep exploring, and definitely keep defending.